Hello, Bob here. Now, I have trouble using words like branding and rebranding non ironically. However, the fact is that my podcast, The Wright Show, is about to undergo some rebranding, and so is Blogging Heads TV, the YouTube channel that the video version of the show appears on. So I thought I'd give you a heads up. Starting in late June, the YouTube channel will be called Non-Zero, and so will the podcast. Now, technically, the podcast will be called Robert Wright's Non-Zero, so you'll find it under R in any alphabetical list of podcasts. Meanwhile, my Substack newsletter's name will not change. And since its name is already Non-Zero, that means that we are witnessing a case of brand unification. 3 brands are becoming one. My content is becoming less confusing in at least this one sense. So, what does this mean for you? Not that much. If you already subscribe to the YouTube channel or to the Wright Show podcast, you'll be automatically subscribed to the rebranded version. And by the way, if you're not already subscribed to both, you should take remedial action immediately. And make sure you're subscribed to the Non-Zero newsletter too. Now, I have to say, I will be sad to see the name Blogging Heads fade into the background. I started the Blogging Heads TV website in 2005, along with Mickey Kaus and Greg Dingle, and I will always be proud of our vast and rich archives, which, by the way, will still be available at www.bloggingheads.tv. And actually, for the time being, new content will be posted there in addition to on YouTube, so the site won't immediately turn into just some kind of museum. Speaking of Mickey Kaus, the Friday podcast I do with him will still be in the Wright Show. That is the Non-Zero podcast feed. And the paywalled after podcast I do with him each Friday will still be available at patreon.com/parrotroom and also available to paid subscribers of the Non-Zero newsletter. And I very much recommend the Parrot Room. So I close with this guidance. If you see something called Non-Zero and you don't already subscribe to it, subscribe to it. And if you want to rate and review and click the like button and stuff like that, so much the better. Thanks, and I will see you soon in Non-Zero land. Hi, Nikita.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm doing okay. I'm in an Armenian village, 40 minutes away from the capital. A short walk from a Hellenistic temple that was built in the 1st century AD. It's a nice place. Nice
That's
spot.
cool. You spend much time at the temple?
No, I was there. I visited once before we moved here on like a tourist kind of trip, and I haven't visited since. You have to get a ticket, which is what stops me.
Now, do you know what gods or God were or was originally worshipped in the temple?
I'm not sure. I've heard Mitra, but when I went to like the Wikipedia page for the thing, it said nothing. It just says pagan temple from the 1st century AD. It looks very Greek, very classic Greece.
Well, our regular viewers and listeners are familiar with you. You're Nikita Petrov, a Russian who normally lives in St. Petersburg, and you've worked with us for some time. Not as much now as you used to, but still some. And more to the point, after the invasion of Ukraine, you decided to leave Russia, and we had a conversation about that. You might want to recap that a little in case for people who missed it. But now you want to talk about something related to that, to the Ukraine invasion, but different, right? Do you want to set the stage for this?
Sure, yeah. So I have a newsletter, Psychopolitica at Substack. It turns out that one of the readers of that newsletter just started a new job at a large American newspaper. And he is a fan of the newsletter, and so he reached out to me asking whether I want to write and draw, which is what I do at the newsletter. It's usually a mix of drawing and writing for this newspaper on this topic, the invasion of Ukraine, my voluntary exile from Russia, how I'm processing it. I guess the idea being to provide the American English-speaking audience with a perspective from the other side. And so I started working on that. And the more I worked on this, the more I realized that this is a daunting task for a few reasons. Some just like creative challenges. How do I transport my sort of genre, what I'm trying to do, to a different platform? But the other problem is the reason I want to talk to you and try to clear my thinking a little bit. So at first, my initial inclination was to just present this trajectory of my life and my attempts at gaining political agency, let's say, juxtapose it with the history of the country, and from that series of snapshots, try to figure out whether I ever had any agency. If I did, how did I squander it? And how much responsibility for what is happening is on me, is on the Russian people broadly, or is it just, Putin and the regime? This is a topic that all of these Russians who left and many of those who stayed are talking about these days. It's a difficult, emotional thing. There are a lot of feelings of shame associated with this war, and we're trying to figure out our place in this. And so I started jotting that down. And then I realized I'm not writing for my small circle, for people who understand who I am and get my, okay, this is personal musings and reflection and whatnot. This is going to be a wider, if this piece does get published, which it might not. But if it does get published, it'll be read by a wider audience, English speaking. The piece will inevitably become a part of a larger narrative of, that paper. And if I just focus on this question that is the closest to my heart, which is the distribution of responsibility for this between the state and the people, I fear that it'll turn into a Russia is evil kind of piece. It's just like, is it the head of Russia or the entire country? But the general conclusion is still Russia is evil.
Yeah, and I'm not sure America needs more Russia is evil messaging at this point, but...
Right. That's been written, and also that is not challenging the reader to think about their part in this. And I think I want to do some of that, but though I also don't want to shift the responsibility from us to somebody else. And I don't want to be asking this question directly, dear reader, what is your place on this? But I want to somehow make it a little more complex than what we're thinking about. So, I know that you've been following this closely, and you've been following American foreign policy and foreign policy generally, sort of international dealings for a very long time. You've been talking to experts, and yet you're a much more detached observer of the situation than I am. So I thought if we talk, maybe I can figure out a little better what it is that I'm trying to say, how I want to say it, because I'm not totally sure on that just yet.
Okay. Is there a bird in your apartment, by the way?
I'm not in it. This is the one problem with living in this village is the internet doesn't really work at the house, at the guest house we're renting. The internet works well outside. So I'm sitting outside in the yard. I had to
okay.
move the table because it started raining at one point. I was sitting where there is no roof, and all of my equipment started getting raindrops on it.
Okay.
So there's going to be background noise. You might hear dogs barking and
you might hear that at my end. There are 2 dogs within 15 feet of me. But anyway, it's a nice bird. I like the bird. So let me say one thing quickly. I don't know to what extent this kind of thing helps at all, but just in terms of reacting to the way you're framing this and kind of comparing it to the way I might frame the comparable question, if it's of any interest, how things are processed in Russia as opposed to America. When I first heard you say in an email, actually, you were trying to figure out how to allocate responsibility for the invasion between the Russian state and the Russian people. And then in this conversation, you said between the regime and the people. I thought, that's not, when I look back to like the Iraq War, I think there is the government, there is the people, but there's also like the establishment, okay? There's the think tanks and the periodicals and all these people who got behind the war. And then there's these interests that funded them, including the arms industry, funded some of the people who actually helped get us into the war. I'm wondering, there must be an establishment in Russia that's not exactly the same as the government officials, right? That goes beyond them and exerts some influence. And I think it's a little bit of a mystery to Americans. Well, A, if that's the case, and B, if it is the case, how exactly these things work. I mean, I think the average American thinks, okay, there's Russia state TV, complete propaganda. But I'm not quite sure whether that's true. I mean, my impression is there's a certain amount of autonomy exercised by people who appear on Russian state TV, even if exercising too much of it will lead them to no longer be on Russian state TV, that it's still the case that if you pay close attention to these kind of talk shows, you can see how like the Overton window is shifting or something, so I don't think this is central to your mission with the assignment, and I don't want to spend too much time on that. But I just wanted to say that that's the first thing that struck me about your kind of state versus people or regime versus people framing.
Yeah, I guess, there is the sort of interim zone. Like, where do certain individuals or institutions fall? Am I thinking about them as the people or as the regime? And there are a lot of conversations about that, how much responsibility these people bear. You may call them, or people do call them, collaborators. It could be
collaborators with the regime.
With the regime, yeah. So it's like
people like you call them that. I mean, people like your friends might call them that. Or
right. I don't
mean you do.
I guess I normally don't use that term, but I might. There is. So in regards to media, I guess the way I'm thinking about it is it's almost like a branch of the government.
Okay.
Right? It's supposed to be independent. And the courts are supposed to be independent from the executive branch, but they're not really. In certain cases, they're not at all. And I suppose it's kind of the same with state TV. They must have some autonomy. They must have. This relates to. So I'm thinking about this in terms of responsibility, and the way I've been thinking about it lately is we are all making choices, and we should take responsibility for the consequence of those choices. The people at the first channel, second channel, fourth channel are making choices. They're constrained by the environment they're in. They know that if they step too far in one direction or the other, they'll lose their position. They might have to leave the country, which has happened to some, or they might continue doing what they're doing, and their jobs are going to be secure, and they're going to have a lot of money, and then they should take responsibility for that, for what they're saying on that.
Yeah, I guess in a way the question I'm asking is, how do I mean, you seem you're seriously entertaining the possibility that the people of Russia bear a lot of responsibility for the invasion. You think that at least could be the case. Now, that might surprise at least a few Americans who think that, dictators, autocrats, they just do what they want to do. The people are, in effect, powerless to resist, and that's that. So that alone might surprise some Americans. But I guess when I compare the thing to America, I'm kind of implicitly asking, well, what is the feedback process by which popular opinion might have made a decisive difference here? A lot of Americans, as I just said, think there isn't one in Russia, but and in the one in America involves this thing, the establishment and the media and think tanks and so on, and people have different ideas about the extent to which those are themselves autonomous actors, as opposed to this, in effect, being one big kind of deep state or something. But in a way, I'm asking, like, what could the people in Russia have done? Leave aside the question whether you personally could have exerted the decisive influence, because I know, just in listening to you talk, you're almost a little guilt-ridden yourself. It sounds like.
I am, yeah. And there are two questions that are related here: my responsibility and the responsibility of the people. And I guess there are in between those, you can say the responsibility of, let's say, the pro-democracy movement in Russia. So there are these people who have been trying to fight the regime and failed.
And you were part of that.
And I was part of that. So when I'm thinking about my trajectory, I'm thinking, okay, so there was a time when I'm a toddler. I clearly don't have any agency here. Things are happening at that time. The Soviet Union falls apart, and even there, the question of, how much the people have a say in that, because this is 1991. 2 in the beginning of the year, 3 at the end of that year. March of that year, there's a referendum that 9 out of 15 Soviet republics take part in. 78% vote that the Soviet Union should be preserved. There's a formulation, preserved as a renewed federation, I think, of sovereign republics, in which the rights and freedoms of all individuals, regardless of their nationality, must be protected. 78% vote yes, the Soviet Union should be preserved. December of that year, presidents of 3 of those republics, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, sign a document saying that the Soviet Union is no more. This is done behind the back of the president of the Soviet Union and in contradiction to the results of that referendum. So the people were asked, and the response was gotten, and that didn't matter. I'm simplifying, I'm sure. There was a lot of things happening between those two events. There was a failed coup by the party hardliners who would like to preserve the Soviet Union. They didn't like the renewed federation part of that proposition. But regardless, the decision was made by 3 men, not by the people. And then, okay, fast forward, or, jump next to 1993, there is the constitutional crisis. There is a parliament that's controlled by, this is Russia now, this is, Soviet Union is no more. But it's not clear whether the president or the parliament have more power. The parliament is controlled by the communists. The president, Boris Yeltsin, capitalist, ostensibly democratic, enjoys the support of the US, from what I understand. Again, might be too broad of a brush I'm using. He decides to order the army to fire at the building of the parliament. That's how that issue was resolved. The parliament and the president almost simultaneously produce a document saying the other one is not a legitimate force anymore. And then we move on. Okay, so Russia now is a capitalist, democratic, they say, though I don't know how democratic that is to, resolve your issues with the parliament by shooting at the building. and I'm 5. I'm still not anywhere close to being able to exert any kind of influence. Well, then
I don't think we can blame you for not intervening at that point to stop the firing on Parliament.
At some point, I am trying to gain political agency, right? So that's like 2011, the first protest that I go to where I'm arrested. And then there is a few years of me attending these rallies in Navalny's formulation as if it was your job. He would make these speeches at these rallies like, so we've done a few of them and nothing seems to be happening. People are saying, well, how many more rallies do I need to go before it starts to have an effect? And he said, well, you show up to your work every day. You should show up to these rallies. I was doing that for a while. I campaigned for Navalny in the mayoral election of 2013. I was passing out newspapers on the street. So I was trying to do these things. I don't think I've succeeded at all. We're not seeing improvements in the regime, in how the state is functioning. And so then I can be asking
Can I just intervene and just quickly say, these things are long, slow processes, and Navalny has accomplished something. The whole world is aware of him, and so on. So, I mean, I think when you hope for change on the scale you were talking about, you have to kind of take the long view and ask whether, as bad as things look, you haven't secured some victories that put like a little money in the bank, so to speak, that may pay off down the road. But anyway.
They might, though it doesn't feel like that now.
Hey, I know the feeling. I'm not wild about the way things are going over here in a very different sense. But anyway, go ahead. Go ahead. I interrupted you. Go ahead with your narrative.
So that's one kind of crux of issues. My responsibility, the responsibility of this movement of people who were bigger parts of that movement, like Navalny. Did he accomplish anything? Or other activists? And if not, why not? Should have they been doing things differently? And then jump into now talking about the responsibility of the Russian people. I don't feel like we, like February 24, we know that the war is started. At that point, most of us feel powerless. 2012, we didn't.
By us, you mean those of you who were inclined to oppose the war, and which was a minority of Russians, I assume?
That I don't know. We don't have the numbers. I don't know how you would get those numbers. But there is a somewhat intuitive attempt at assessing that question. So if we're talking about numbers, there have been these polls that say 70 or 80% support the war. I don't think we can really trust these because who are the people answering those polls? There is I was listening to an interview. There's this woman, Ekaterina Schulman. She's a sociologist, and she made the point that when you're looking at the results of any kind of a poll, you should also be looking at a number, forget the correct sociological term, the percentage of people who decline to answer the question.
Mm-hmm.
And she said that number was always high in Russia, at least in the recent history, but in the first weeks and months of the war, it was 97%.
Uh-huh.
So you're talking about what, let's say 80% of the 3% said they support the war. And when you're asked this question in the current Russian reality, the question is not so much about the war. It's like, are you going to fall in line or not? Are you saying you support the authorities or not? And you know that if you say no, you're inviting trouble. So those numbers, I don't think we can. There must be something that we can do with them, but not taking them at face
value.
value.
Well, that's interesting because I had heard conflicting reports about how much credibility we should give those. So anyway, I derailed you again. You're talking about February 24th, Russians who opposed the war. They did do some things.
People went into the streets, not a ton, and my feeling at the time was, this is the reason you go into the street in that situation is not really so that you can change the course of history. It's more that you can live with yourself down the road. It's more that you're not going to say that I stayed at home and didn't try to do anything. I don't think that many people thought we're going to go into the streets and then things are going to change.
Mm-hmm.
But there are people who voiced their protest. There are people who didn't like what's happening and stayed silent. And then there were people who voiced their support, and either privately or publicly. And to me, the amount of those people was a shock. When I heard the news, when I watched this address of Putin's in the morning, everybody I know felt, well, clearly everybody is as shocked and appalled by this as I am. And then day by day, it became clear that this is not the case. It became clear from walking down the street or driving down the street and seeing like we're in a traffic jam and a car passes us with that Z letter taped to the rear window of the car. Specific instance I'm thinking about, it was a BMW of all cars. So there's that. And then you have, early on, a friend of mine, or of my fiance, forwarded us a screenshot of her conversation with her mother, in which the girl was then in Bali. She's a freelancer, working in a paradise island. And her mother is telling her, "You're a traitor. I don't even know if I'm talking to my daughter. I'm shocked to see you're being so unpatriotic. We're trying to fight the Nazis," that whole thing. And this is not an isolated incident. That situation, a child who's, not a person in their 30s or late 20s, talking to their parents and realizing they don't know how to talk to their parents anymore because they're so opposed to one another on such a fundamental issue. There are people being killed, and you disagree on whether that's a good or a bad thing. There were and are many, many situations like that.
Okay. And can I say that this this issue, I think, is one of interest to Americans and kind of a hobby horse of mine. As you know, I'm kind of obsessed with trying to get people to work hard to understand how things are viewed by other people, especially people on the other side of kind of lines of antagonism, right? Like, and so that's a question that I'm always interested in seeing illuminated by Russians. In other words, what exactly is going on? If we accept, as seems to be the case, that some substantial number of Russians support the war. And I think this is, Americans, if that's the case, first of all, Americans need to understand that. We need to understand like what we're up against, so to speak, like how, because I think early on in the war, these American hopes, the regime will crumble. They've gone too far, right? And Russians, won't put up with this and so on. I think it's always important to understand clearly what is happening on the other side. And I think any clues as to what's kind of going on psychologically there. I think most Americans think, well, Putin went on TV and said there's Nazis over there, so we're going to invade. And people went, well, whatever you say. I think it's got to be more complicated than that, right? Like there was a background to this. There was history to this. There was the way Ukraine was conceived by various people. There was a certain amount of awareness in Russia that there were native Russian speakers in the east of Ukraine, especially. You might call them ethnic Russians. They might identify more closely with their Russian heritage, who did feel discriminated against by the Ukrainian government and so on. So, and I assume there was some awareness of that in Russia and so on. So my point is just, and this is just me, you're not writing this piece for me, but my own curiosity, and I think I think the curiosity of a lot of Americans, and I think curiosity it would be good to address, is to some extent about this question of what do things look like to the mother of this woman in Bali, and how did she come to have this view? I mean, I'll give you an example of something that would shock Americans. As I understand it, Navalny, we think of as this kind of liberal icon or something, and he himself has a little bit of nationalist in him. And my understanding is that when Russia seized Crimea, he was like fine with that. He was like, yeah, right. I mean, maybe I'm
not exactly. He wasn't fine with it. The thing that he's gotten a lot of flack for, and he said something that antagonized a lot of Ukrainians was, so after Crimea was annexed, he was asked, say you do get in power, what happens with Crimea? Do you give it back? And he said, the quote is something like, Crimea is not a sandwich to decide, first Putin takes it, then Navalny gets into power, Navalny gives it back, somebody else takes power, they try to take it back. He said that this is not going to be resolved quickly or easily. It's going to be a long situation. It's going to be one of these disputed territories, and we're going to need to find a way to resolve it legitimately with referendums and whatnot.
Okay.
So he was not fine with it, but he was not saying, if I get in power, I give Crimea back. Okay,
so I misunderstood that a little. So anyway, back to, again, I derailed you, and you're talking about, I guess you're talking about the mother of the woman in Bali or something. But anyway, you're talking about this disconnect between people who oppose the war and some others.
Yeah. And there, okay, so you talked about the background for this. There is a background. It is also not one that is just like, it's not that how aware people are of what's happening in Ukraine. It's also how the situation in Ukraine is presented to them by the state media. And I really underestimated the power of this propaganda and the scope of it and how long it's been going on. Like, I've known all these things, but I underestimated the effects. So with Ukraine, I went to Ukraine when I was 17 to Western Ukraine. This was shortly after the Orange Revolution. So that's like 2005, I guess. And I remember some trepidation on my part because we've all heard about these Ukrainian nationalists who really don't like Russians, especially now. And so I might, somebody might beat me up or whatever. People were telling me things like that. I didn't find anything of the sort. There was one moment I was with my girlfriend and we got lost in some part of town. We were looking at, castles and whatnot. And we got lost and there were some men drinking. And I approached them and asked, how do I get, wherever, to the hotel or the subway station or something? And one of them stood up and said, I'll show you. And he went forward and we followed him. So it's him, then me, then my girlfriend. And we're talking and he says, so where are you from? And I say, from Moscow. And he stops in his tracks and I feel tense. I feel like he's going to turn around and this is going to be an altercation because there was such a immediate reaction. Like he was walking and then he stopped and then he turned around and then he says, Moscow? I have a woman in Moscow. I'm gonna, and then he had this whole thing with Start by Some Place where he had 4 volumes of Liskov, the writer, that he wanted us to bring to his woman in Moscow. We didn't see any, anti-Russian sentiment at all. But we thought we would see some. And that's 05. And then from that moment on, the narrative about the Ukrainian nationalists have been increasing on the state media. So when Putin says Ukraine, that there's a Nazi regime in Ukraine, to me it sounds bizarre. To a lot of people who have been watching TV for 15 years by that time, it's not a shock. It's like, yeah, we've heard about this. So there is propaganda, and it has an effect. And yet, this is an argument that I'm having with my fiance all the time now. We're not an argument, but a conversation. She's much more... She's more emotional about this, and more... there's more anger on her part towards the Russian people. And she makes a point which I think is an important one. Okay, there is propaganda. Some people manage to not get swayed by it. Some people manage to turn the TV off. And some people chose to keep watching this, even as TV was getting worse and worse. Just the quality of this, it's not nuanced. It's people yelling at one another and talking about Nazis and nuclear war.
Well, what time frame are we talking about when you say you mean it's getting worse about Ukraine? And
it's been getting worse on all fronts.
So TV has been getting more kind of angry.
Yeah. More angry, and fewer points of view are presented.
For years now?
Yeah.
Okay.
But there is... So another anecdote is... Well, 2 illustrations of this dynamic. One is, when I lived in Moscow, I would visit my parents who live sort of outside of Moscow every once in a while for a couple of days, and their TV runs in the background. And I remember going there when Navalny was being tried. There was this corruption case against him, that he stole the forest in a region where he served as like an advisor to the governor. And I'm at the time this staunch Navalny supporter. Like, I go to these rallies, I campaign for him. I'm a part of this on one of the sides, and not the side that's presented on TV. And I'm not sitting there watching television, but I go from the kitchen to the room, and I hear TV, and TV keeps saying Navalny stole the forest, Navalny keeps stealing the money, the horrible Navalny. And by the end of the 2 days that I'm there, I notice in the background of my mind some irritation with this motherfucker, because he keeps stealing the forest. It's not my thought, and I don't agree with it, but it's there. And it's just a couple of days of this thing being in the background. Another illustration is recent. I was talking to my mother on the phone, and she's saying, I'm at the dacha, I turn the TV on, and she says they're smart about it, because they have 2 different kind of modes. You switch one channel, and it's just yelling. And then you switch to another channel, and there are these calm people who are presented as experts who are saying, we're going to be fine. These sanctions are not going to, destroy the Russian economy. In fact, they're destroying the European economy. Their prices are going up. And our people have been through many a crisis, and we know how to survive one. And those Europeans can't, and you can't just exclude Russia from the world economy. It's going to bite them in the ass. And she says, I'm listening to this, and I'm realizing that it's having an effect on me. It's not that I feel that I support the war suddenly, but I'm starting to feel, you know what, we're going to manage. Like, the country is not going to fall apart. The economy is not going to fall apart. And then she says, I switch the TV off. I turn the radio on. which I guess now maybe that was already a figure of speech, because the one independent radio station has been disconnected since the beginning of the war, but they moved their program into YouTube. So maybe she was listening to YouTube. And there are other experts, and they're saying, oh yeah, we're so fucked. This is not gonna, we're not feeling it yet. Wait until autumn, when the goods that are stored in storages are gonna be done, and we'll see the full extent of the effect of these sanctions.
So there were people allowed to say we're fucked?
So those are, as I said, there was a radio station where you would hear that, but that radio station got disconnected, I think, a couple of weeks into the war. So they moved to YouTube. YouTube is the one place that remains accessible. You don't need VPN, unlike with Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. And there is a lot of that kind of content on YouTube. I don't know what's going to happen with that. At some point, they're going to have to, I guess, disconnect it or something. It would be in line with a strategy. But my point is, again, getting back to this question of responsibility and choices, I can look at the effects of propaganda and explain why people support the war through that lens.
Mm-hmm.
That's your hobby horse. Explain, excuse, conflation, or what is the term that you use?
Yeah, I mean, I try to emphasize that to explain why somebody did something bad or supported something bad is not to excuse them. And yeah, I call our intuition that it is to excuse them, which is a natural human intuition. I call the explain, excuse conflation. And I think it gets in the way of just honest inquiry, just trying to figure out, okay, like, why did Putin invade? Let's try to get inside his head, figure it out, get inside the heads of the people in Russia who supported him and so on. Just understand the thing. You when you try to do that, you get big time blowback from people who say, oh, you just want to absolve him of blame. And these are, if you mention NATO expansion, it's a Putin talking point and blah, blah, blah. So yeah, that's the thing I try to guard against.
That's the question that we're struggling with in relation to the people more than the regime. I can explain the support for the war by talking about the effects of this propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
At some point, I do feel like I'm excusing them. At some point, I feel like you can explain it to an extent, but at some point, there is the individual choice of keeping listening to it, of getting it, of allowing it to replace your thinking. Right? When you're not making your decisions yourself and figuring out how you feel about the situation or think about the situation yourself, when that gets replaced by whatever TV tells you, shouldn't you have some agency here, at least in your own thinking? It's one thing when you want to exert influence and you don't know how to. It's another when you don't even think that way, and you're just repeating what TV says. And also it's kind of patronizing as well. If I say that the person I disagree with is not thinking for themselves and they're just parroting propaganda, I'm reducing them to less than an agent in their own thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of those issues that we're struggling with. And Karina, my fiance, says, I'm sorry to say this, at some point I just have to say these people are, if not evil, then dumb. If they keep swallowing this propaganda, at some point you should have noticed the contradictions within the narrative and whatnot. So thinking back to the piece I'm trying to write, I think I don't want to give answers, but I want to pose these questions. And that would be one of those questions. And then another reason I want to talk to you is, again, I said, we're focusing on Russia, our part in this. And I feel uneasy talking about anybody else, the responsibility of the United States, Europe, even more so Ukraine. But I also don't want to be solipsistic and just focusing on, oh, my shame, my guilt, when we're all making these choices, and whether it may be that expanding NATO to the east was a correct choice. It may be, and I can defend that position. It's easy to defend it now. Well, the reason NATO needed to expand to the east is so that when Russia invades, or when Russia tries to invade or thinks about invading the country, they can't, because that country is a member of NATO. I can provide a counterpoint to that. In case with Ukraine, even if that is your strategy, you promised NATO membership sometime in the future, but you didn't accept Ukraine into NATO. And so Russia was able to invade. And one can certainly argue that part of the reason Russia invaded is this expansion of NATO. Here, I'm sorry, I'm sort of rambling, but I do want to mention this one thing here. I posted, I think you saw this a while ago, I posted this excerpt from an interview with Alexei Arestovich. He's an advisor to Zelensky. And this is an interview from 2019 where he predicts the war pretty precisely. And his analysis of the situation and his conclusions from that analysis, to me, actually do sound like this is a person who is aware that there are choices to be made, and he's explaining what choice they're going to make and why, and then the difficult question is whether he was right or wrong. But what he's saying is, listen, simply geographically speaking, Ukraine is not going to be able to maintain neutrality. Neutrality costs a lot. Neutrality is more expensive than a war because you need a standing army that will protect your neutrality. We have this huge border with Russia. He actually mentions he says, and what about Hungary? And what about other territorial claims? Because there are parts of Ukraine that used to belong to other countries. He does that in passing. Russia is certainly the big topic there. But he says, simply geographically, we're not going to be able to maintain neutrality. We have to either join NATO or join the Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan Union. And I don't want that. We've been in the Soviet Union already. I didn't like that. I want to try the other option. So we should try to join NATO. What happens if we try to do that is it will provoke Russia to attack, and they will have to do it before we join, because the point of this attack would be to turn everything into rubble here, so that we are not so that NATO is not interested in us anymore. They don't want a country that's destroyed. There's no infrastructure, and so he's laying it out in 2019 as like, this is how it's going to go. We're going to try to join NATO. We're not going to be able to because Russia will attack first. And the other option is we're going to be consumed by Russia in 10 to 12 years. He doesn't specify by which means, whether it's going to be, in his mind, military intervention or something more gradual and peaceful with fewer people dying. But he says that's the fork in the road. That's the choice we're facing. Either we're consumed by Russia, or we try to join NATO, we fail, Russia attacks. The reporter then asks, well, which of these choices is better? And he says, a big war with Russia is better, and then a victory in that war, and then NATO membership as a result of the victory in that war. That's how he was going into this. And that does seem to me, I don't feel like I'm in the position to judge whether that's a correct or an incorrect choice. And I would hate to feel that kind of responsibility myself to make these kinds of decisions. But he does seem to be aware that this is a choice, restricted one. He's restricted by the situation he's in, but he says, I can do this or I can do that, and I'm choosing to do this, and there are going to be consequences, but I think they're worth it. And I don't hear a lot of that on the various sides. Putin says we were not given any choice. We had to do this because blah, blah, blah. And maybe I'm missing parts of the conversation in the West, but it seems that the prevalent approach is also not that we are making choices that are going to be consequences and we're going to take the responsibility for these consequences. It's more that we have to do this. There's no other choice.
Well, of course, people always argue that, even when there are conflicting perspectives. Like in America, they tend to both say we have no choice but to do what I think is right. That's a common way of framing these things. So I don't know. On the American side, I don't know. I mean, a footnote to this is that I think one thing Putin did emphasize in his last speech before the invasion, that between 2019 and when he invaded, there was something that was happening, which was that NATO was in fact sending more and more weapons into Ukraine and more trainers into Ukraine. And he basically said, look, it is becoming a NATO outpost. And why wait? I mean, the more time, the more the thing I said we couldn't tolerate, that it become a NATO outpost, it is de facto becoming. And I told him I couldn't tolerate this. We're not going to tolerate it. And it doesn't make any sense to wait if every day they're sending more weapons in. It's only going to be harder to undo this tomorrow. I mean, that's the thing. That's one thing I'd add to his perspective. But I know we don't want to turn this into a big argument of whether this was inevitable, whether this guy was right that in 2019 it was already inevitable. I mean, you're very interested in the question of choice and agency, and its existence at the individual level and the popular mass level and the regime level.
Let me ask you, how much agency do you feel about the actions of America in the world?
How much do I personally feel like responsibility?
You're a voter. You are a person with a platform. You're a journalist. You've written best-selling books. You would seem to have a little more agency in regards to what your state is doing than maybe I do in regards to my state. But my feeling is you feel that this is an uphill battle. You've been criticized in American foreign. You've been criticized in American foreign policy for a long time, and the foreign policy hasn't really changed. Right. So how do you feel about your part in what your country is doing?
I mean, on the one hand, it's discouraging to consistently champion something that never seems to gain critical mass. On the other hand, you never know. And the thing I think you have to keep in mind is you never know which snowflake will cause the avalanche. And you never know, you never know what your influence is, right? It's like every once in a while, somebody will come up and say, I heard you say this, I read your book, whatever, that led me to do this. You just have no idea. So you can't, no matter how discouraging things look, you can't rule out the possibility that you're having more influence than you think. I mean, to get back to your first question in terms of responsibility, I guess what, in a way, maybe the reason I keep trying to push the boulder up the hill is just so that I won't feel guilt. I mean, I tried, it's like, and who knows? Maybe I had some positive influence. Maybe someday it'll pay off. Maybe after I'm dead. Chains of influence are extremely complicated and subtle things. And people who seem relatively inconsequential now, which is how I feel, can still just through a conversation with a neighbor. I mean, wind up, given how weirdly influence works, they can wind up having an influence. So I think I think you try to fight the good fight, what you see as the good fight. And of course, the horrifying thing is you may be wrong. It may not be the good fight, but still all you can do is, you're a human being. You are blessed with some degree of rationality. You try to cultivate that and advocate the things you think are right. And if nothing else, that at least allows you to say, I tried. And so you don't need to be saddled by guilt.
Yeah. There's a thought that I had recently, which is, I think we relate to this notion of responsibility differently depending on whether we're talking about things that have happened and things that are going to happen tomorrow. And the difference is if we're talking, like, let's say, who's responsible for the war, it quickly tends to become this blame game where you're pointing the finger at the other person, or one group points the finger to another group. They're responsible, or they have more responsibility for this. And then if you're talking about things that are happening now or going to happen tomorrow, the responsibility question becomes, again, a choice of what responsibility you take on yourself. Mm-hmm. Like you do have some agency, some choices are there to be made. And I think in the first instance, it's harder to argue for let's all take our share of responsibility for it because of this, well, I had to do this because he was doing that. But in the latter case, I think that's an easier case to be made. You should take responsibility for whatever your actions or lack of actions are, whether you choose to go to a protest, not go to a protest, or in case with these bigger players, you decide on the strategy for your country. There inevitably are going to be consequences. And to say that, the choice you're making today are going to have consequences tomorrow, and those consequences are on you, at least in part, I think that's an easier position to defend.
Yeah. We'll say that again. So what is the easy position to defend? That
you're making choices right now and you should take responsibility for them, as opposed to there's a situation, what is your responsibility for it that's already happened or happening?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's useful to reflect, I think, on the past by way of, especially if that encourages you to make sure that you fight the good fight in the future. But yeah, I basically buy that. I mean, it's an interesting, I looked at this thing you put in your newsletter, Encyclopolitica, where you kind of told your life story. And I gather the idea is, as you suggested earlier in this conversation, you're asking yourself, like, at what point did I have agency? Did the point ever arrive? When I mean, not just agency, but the realistic hope of making a difference. At what point can I be blamed? And it's an interesting way to go through it. I mean, look, you can certainly say look, you got detained by the police at a demonstration, which is an entertaining story. And you're still. I personally think you're performing a service right now. I mean, I have a real belief in the importance of trying to help people understand how things are processed on the other side of the line. And I think you've been doing that for us. You're doing it right now. An interesting part of your kind of self-discovery is, I think, you're realizing you didn't really understand the way a lot of Russians were processing things, right?
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
When the war broke out, because these lines exist everywhere. It's like in America, it's like the Trumpists and the non-Trumpists. And it sounds like the Ukraine war, by the way, have almost that much force in Russia. In other words, it can divide families. And it
has divided families. Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, I don't. My view is you should not be saddled by guilt. But I think the question you're asking is a very interesting one, and of course, it leads me to ask, well, how different are things in America? I mean, again, it's different. What I'm calling the establishment is different, but it has tremendous power collectively. It is less cohesive than the regime. Maybe it's less unified, but fundamentally, I ask the same question. There's always the question, how much power does any one person have who is not like running a country? There's even the question of how much power people running countries have. But there is, beyond that, I think in both countries, there is a version of the question of like, are we just up against overwhelming forces here? It's like when I watched the Iraq war thing unfold, I just couldn't believe it. It was this weird, inexorable, irrational thing that made no sense whatsoever. It's like we kicked the weapons inspectors out of Iraq. There were UN inspectors being allowed to inspect anything they wanted. We kicked them out so that we could invade because we thought they had weapons of mass destruction. Well, when you've got inspectors in, there's an easier way to find out if they have weapons. So I don't want to dwell on that, but it's like, my point is an American can have the feeling you may have, which is just like, oh my God, this is hopeless. Mm-hmm. Even though seemingly it was a much more diffuse kind of support for the war. This magazine, NPR, Slate, The New Yorker, The Atlantic, in effect, The New York Times, given some of the reporting, and it's this politician, that politician, this think tank, but you still have the same feeling. And I'm distracting you from your mission. I think you're, but it may help you though to understand that there's a version of that question here. And
there might be a broader question. We can talk about Russians and Americans and the influence Russians have on the Russian state, the Americans have on the American one. But we're also humans living in a world, and maybe these lines are...
Is my dog unduly distracting? Can you hear him?
It's making weird noises.
Yeah, hey, Fraser. Unfortunately, he's deaf, so this has no effect. I'll just mute.
So yeah, I don't know how to approach that part. That we live in a big world that is connected, even if we impose these borders. And I guess one maybe entry point to this conversation is something I guess I've alluded to before. The 1993 constitutional crisis, where the president used the force of the army to consolidate his power, that results in a signing of a constitution. There are many of these points in the Russian history where you can say, okay, this is where it went wrong. This would be one of them, or at least that's one that people use, because that constitution shifted the balance of power significantly towards the president. A term that we use in Russia is a super presidential republic, as opposed to like a parliamentary republic, presidential republic, the balance of power between different branches. And I've tried, but haven't found a detailed description of the involvement of the US in that particular story, but there definitely was involvement. If you go to the USAID website and they list the accomplishments they've made in Russia, making it a more, rule of the law kind of territory and whatnot, they say that they helped draft that constitution. I don't know how that draft looked like. Maybe it was something different than what was eventually signed. But they say we helped draft the constitution, the tax code, this and that. There are a long list of things I've done. And so in thinking about that, I'm again don't have answers, but I have questions about responsibility. So on the one hand, I guess I need to applaud the attempts to make sure that this post-Soviet Russia doesn't go back to the kinds of dictatorships that have existed in Soviet history. On the other hand, well, you've done some things. Now we're looking at the situation. The situation is not good. Is anybody asking about the responsibility for those interventions? Is anybody giving answers to those questions? And I guess a different way to approach it. So this is again the past, and even as I speak, I feel like I'm turning it into some kind of a blame game. Maybe the Russian people should have worked better on preserving the civil liberties and whatnot, and I shouldn't be saying Americans were playing a part in it. But if we look into the future, you could see, I don't know if this is going to go that way, but there is some probability of Russia of today going through the same fate that the Soviet Union did, meaning the regime changes, the country falls apart further. There are more distinctions within Russia, different regions that can try to leave or succeed to leave. And if that happens, is that the end of the story? You, like on the part of the West, we've defeated the evil empire. Congratulations. Or then you have an even more complex task in front of you, trying to make sure that these new whatever replaces Russia, a different version of Russia, or a number of states that Russia falls into. Are you as victors now responsible for what happens tomorrow and the day after? Like when the Allies defeated Nazi Germany, there was a plan there. People were trying to make sure that Germany doesn't be, the same kind of militaristic, expansionist approach does not get reestablished, and they've succeeded. So I guess I'm just trying to point to the fact, I think, that it's not just these different entities and actors that are separate. They're intertwined. They're getting less intertwined now because these ties are being severed. But up until very recently, this wave of sanctions, Russia was a part of this world. There were dealings that were made. There were Schroeder, the ex-chancellor of Germany, was like on board of Russian oil companies. One part of these sanctions is the yachts of these oligarchs are being seized, which makes me want to ask, why did that not happen earlier? Because the oligarchs were making money on, from the state, from their cooperation with the state. This is like Navalny's rhetoric. There's corruption. It's not. That corruption. The Russian corruption is not staying in Russia. The people who are stealing money within the country then go to buy villas and yachts in the West, and they're allowed to use the money that they've gained illegally in these more established economies. And the reason they were doing that, partly because like Italy has better villas than Russia, partly because they thought that their assets are more secure in countries where there is a rule of law. It turns out, not so quick. Your yacht may be bought in a Western country, it can be still seized. But my point is, we have this web of interconnected entities, and even if you defeat the one you see as evil, it's not going to just disappear from the face of the earth. If when the Soviet Union fell apart, it was replaced by Russia and a bunch of other states, and that eventually, in a pretty short time span, led to a reemergence of a sort of Soviet-like entity on the world stage. And when you had the chance, when the Soviet Union just disappeared and Russia was in a bad place, you could have, I guess they've tried, but you could have tried more. You could have done better at making this new country a country where law exists and the different branches of the government are in balance, and the executive doesn't take all the power.
Yeah, America would say they really encouraged that. They tried to talk to Putin and so on. I suspect one critique of America would be, well, there were a lot of well-intentioned people in America and trying to make democracy and rule of law work in Russia. But the truth is, there was also a powerful impetus behind letting big corporations make a lot of money in Russia. And so to some extent, like, hey, you choose your oligarchs, we don't care as long as we get a piece of the action. I think that would be a critique of the way America wound up, in effect, approaching some of this. I have as far as rule of law, I have a slightly different question. Because what you put this in a very autobiographical way, including in the latest issue of your newsletter. I know from talking to you in the past that you remember the part of the 1990s that was just horrific economically. There was a real sense of kind of crisis in Russia. And I gather that one reason Putin managed to amass a certain amount of popular support is he is perceived as the savior. Am I wrong? I mean, he helped bring things back under control after there was a sense that Yeltsin had let them spin out of control. Is that wrong? I thought that was responsible for some of his public support.
He certainly takes credit for that. I'm not sure how legitimate that is, because it's like I was listening to an interview with some guy from Belarus, and he was like the interviewer. I don't think he believed the position he was advocating. He was playing the devil's advocate, the interviewer. But he said, "Listen, there is a very good IT sector in Belarus. So shouldn't you credit Lukashenko with at least that?" And the guy said, "Yeah, well, the reason there's a good IT sector is Lukashenko has no idea what IT is, and so didn't try to meddle a whole lot." Mm. And similarly, in Russia, it is true that Putin's tenure coincided with an economic growth. How much it is to his credit, I don't know. The Russian economy is very closely tied with like oil prices. Right. And the oil prices during Gorbachev's or Yeltsin's tenure were very low, and then they got higher. And I don't know how oil prices work. Mm-hmm. Maybe maybe the reason they got higher is because some deals, they made with OPEC or something. But he definitely takes credit for this, and he demonizes the 1990s further. Maybe he paints even a grimmer picture than the already grim picture that they were in reality. But yes, he's taking credit for that, and a lot of people are happy to give him that.
Okay. Well, is there anything else you want to? I don't feel I've helped you a lot. It seems so. You're the question you seem to be kind of unrolling in that newsletter is, again, it's like, at what point did I have a chance to change things, and did I fail to?
Correct. And I guess a second question is, if I didn't have agency, then who did? And what responsibility all of us should take for what has happened in me, the Russian pro-democracy movement, the people watching TV in Russia, the American establishment, the American voters, and so forth. And I don't want to, I feel weird on the one hand, I feel weird like mentioning in this sequence Ukraine, because they're clearly the victim here. But then I don't want to not mention because I don't want to take agency from them.
Well, yeah. And look, let's face it. After the 2014 revolution, one of the first things the new government did was demote the status of the Russian language in Ukraine. And then some people kind of rushed in, including some Westerners, I think, and said, wait, this doesn't look too good. And they kind of rolled it back or something. But those things did not go unnoticed by native Russian speakers in Eastern Ukraine. And they didn't help. So, and I'm sure, look, there's a counter argument. There's like, wait a second, we are this small Ukrainian nationality that historically has had trouble carving out, its identity in a way that gets respected by regional powers. And
you can argue that, I wouldn't be able to make that argument well, but you can argue that the reason the Russian language is so prevalent in Ukraine is because of the policy of the Soviet Union, where these smaller republics were Russianized to an extent, where the local languages were discriminated against because they were trying to unify the country. Yeah.
Yeah, it's this consistently troubling question of what you do when national boundaries don't coincide with linguistic or ethnic boundaries. And it just has a history of causing tremendous trouble. And you would like to think that humankind would have gotten to a point where we can settle these things without war. We seem not to have. So I don't know. Of course, as you know, it's my view that you shouldn't be too hard on yourself. You've tried your best. You continue to within your own, chosen vocation, which is basically, leaving aside the way you actually make a living. What I mean is your chosen kind of craft, which is, kind of a combination of art, a very interesting combination of art and writing. And you're still doing that. You're doing it with this piece.
Yeah, I'm trying to. Yeah.
So, I should go because I'm going to go on a podcast and say a series of things that will continue to fail to alter the course of history as they reliably have done in the past. But I'm obviously happy to talk to you about this offline too. and give you any feedback you want. But do you have any last? Is there a last, like,
well, let me throw something at you, and I wonder how you will react or perceive it. So there is a conversation. I guess I'm not going to mention the person, but a person from the older generation, like my parents' generation, a guy who was very angry and upset at the war. He's been angry and upset with the Russian government and the Russian state and the Soviet state before that. But his take on the war was not that just that it was, morally abhorrent and all that, but it's also a failure. Was going to happen. His take was that Putin was played like a sucker by the United States. He started the war. Russia is now going to be rightfully seen as this degenerate state, violent state that it is. It's going to be, all the ties are going to be severed. And he's destroying Ukraine. He's also destroying Russia. And this is all perfectly well and good with the United States, because the United States is fine. The havoc is being, whatever the verb is here, and that is a success of the American foreign policy.
Well, that's a view on the American left too. That I mean, you could construct the cynical reading of all this that, we did intentionally lure the Soviet Union into Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. That was an expressed desire of Jimmy Carter's national security advisor. And that was a long and destructive war for the Soviet Union. Some people think it's what, hastened the end of the Cold War. You can construct a narrative like that here, right? We put these weapons in, it was like bait. And by that time, there were enough weapons that we could really get them mired here. I think that almost attributes too much kind of coherence to U.S. foreign policy planning, but it's an argument you hear that and certainly when the U.S. Secretary of Defense says our goal is to weaken Russia, that kind of encourages interpretations. I was actually going to ask you if you think if things like that really get your attention and you think they really get Russia's attention and help Putin. But that's not mission central for you right now. But I'm sure that you were aware, right, when the Secretary of Defense said our goal is to weaken Russia?
Sure, yeah. And again, I can defend that position myself. Maybe Russia needs to be weakened. But again, to me, the question of the assignment of the blame is actually pretty straightforward. Putin did start this war. The people are dying because of him. But then if you replace blame with, again, this notion of responsibility, then I think it becomes a little bit of a different story where we all need to try to sort this mess out, and we are now all responsible for what happens. Mm-hmm. At least that's my current thinking as I'm struggling with these issues.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's continue the conversation offline.
Okay. Thank you.
And we will watch with interest the progress of this particular project. Thanks so much. And
thank you.
And we will speak very soon.
Okay. Take care.